Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's a pleasure to host this webinar about digital communication management via digital media arenas. I'm Grazia Murtarelli. I'm network leader at EUPRERA about the network digital transformation and PR. And this is one of the webinars that we wanted to organize in order to stimulate discussion, comparisons, thoughts about the topic of digital communication, digital transformation, digital public relation. I'm not alone today. I have the pleasure to engage in an interesting dialogue with other three speakers. So with me, there will be Mark Badham from Leeds Beckett University, Vilma Luoma-aho from School of Business and Economics of Jyväskylä, and Stephen Waddington from UK. So I invite them to join me so we can start the discussion. Please feel free to share your comments, your questions during the webinar. I have some questions to pose it to our speakers, and welcome to all, and thank you for joining us. And then, but if everybody wants to comment or want to pose questions, please feel free to do in the comment section. Okay, so I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself or if I can pose it to the first questions that I'm ready to do. So Mark, Vilma, and Stephen, as you prefer. If you agree, I can start with the first questions, and then we can start to dialogue. So I see, yes, okay. And I would like to start off with Mark. So my first question is for you, because we are introducing a topic that is probably, so it's innovative in a certain sense. It is the digital media arenas. So, and probably not all knows what digital media arenas are. So if you could explain to us, and if you can give us some example of them.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Grazia. The digital media arena framework, well, the digital media arenas themselves, we have defined in a couple of our research publications. If I could just summarize them, perhaps to begin with, they are, the word digital, I guess, is a priority there. They're online communication spaces where not only does the brand of the organization communicate, but stakeholders, members of the public, anyone can communicate. We traditionally understand the word media in terms of it being a channel for one or two-way communication. But we combine that or hyphenate that with arenas, which today dictate how communication happens. So arenas are more discussion forums where stakeholders and publics have power. So if I could just summarize that in a definition, it would be that digital media arenas are online communication spaces that they range in a continuum between unidirectional communication channels and multi-directional communication discussion forums, and that they can be used by organizations. The word management is kind of controversial. We don't know if we can manage them all, but we can try to use them to varying degrees by, for instance, strategic communicators adopting three different roles. One is as a sender, the traditional role of sending a message, publishing a message. The other one is facilitating stakeholder engagement about organizational messages. And thirdly, this role of strategic improvisers of messages when messages are hijacked or taken over. So we've identified at this stage 15 digital media arenas. It kind of begins by adopting the old PESO model, PESO, paid, earned, shared, and owned. I think most of us are familiar with those, but there's a whole lot more. So maybe if I could give you some examples of some of the others. Another one would be placed, which is more of a marketing strategy of product or brand placement, but more and more in public relations. We can use those in newer arenas, I guess you could say, for instance, in esports, in digital games, TV shows, things like that. Sponsored digital media arena is the sixth one. So paid, earned, shared, owned, placed, and sponsored. Sponsored, I think we all understand that one. It's more the PR strategy of getting our message through a sponsored organization. Usually that might be a charity, a festival, things
Mark,
like that.
would we want to show the picture at this point? Because we're not showing the picture, are we?
Yeah, could you do that? Do you have that there?
Yeah, I think Kate has it ready.
Brilliant.
So if you can
brilliant.
zoom in a bit, Kate, is it possible to zoom in? Or is this what we have? Well, this looks like what we have, so let's go with this one.
This shows them all in a kind of a picture, which Vilma probably will be able to explain later why they're in those positions. So the other one is rented. You can see rented there. It's this popular or becoming more popular strategy of using social media influencers in brand or organizational campaigns. We've added a new one called virtual, which is, more and more we will see this happening. These are interactive games in virtual shopping malls where brands can enter into engaging with players or members of the public who are there. Artificial is a new one as well. More and more we'll be seeing that. So artificially constructed texts and images and videos that brands and organizations can engage in with their stakeholders. Advocated, I think a lot of public relations practitioners will understand this one, where there are employees who are advocates of the organization who can be invited to or inspired to communicate about the organization in positive ways, but sometimes it's negative through whistleblowing and things like that. Another one is crowdsourced. You'll start to get a picture here that some of these are more organizations can manage control over their messages more than others. Crowdsourced, less control over the organizational message. Crowdsourced examples would be Wikipedia and other types of wikis, product and service rating sites, review sites like Amazon reviews, Trustpilot. There's a whole range of those. Another one is searched. Digital PR practitioners will understand this one. They're very immersed in searched. Members of the public use searches in, for instance, X or Twitter, as well as in Google and Bing and Yahoo. And organizations, communicators can use that in strategic ways. Curated digital media arenas are another one, where market intelligence reports are produced by information intermediary businesses like Edelman. Edelman produced their trust barometer. So that's a form of curated. Or Gartner produced business insights and trends that these really affect the reputation of corporations. The final two would be recycled and hijacked. Recycled and hijacked are very much beyond a lot of corporate control, with some exceptions. So recycled we define as communication spaces where we see a lot of memes and parodies that content creators use to make fun of and entertain, making fun of brands often. And hijacked is where in social media and other digital media environments, people who don't like the organization, perhaps we call them antagonists or hate holders, opponents, can take over an organizational campaign, a hashtag, take over the corporate message in very, very negative ways. So that's hopefully a bit of a summary for you. Thanks, Grazia.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely interesting. So what I found interesting from the DMA framework that you developed in the Routledge test book that I really invite our viewers to consult, because it's a very food for thought that could be absolutely interesting, is that your DMA framework seems to guide us to navigate the digital media arenas that matter from a professional point of view, because this is not academic topics. So it's absolutely of interest. So, and about the figure that we have seen before, you mentioned many of the different type of arenas, but we have seen also the more traditional one, like paid, shared, owned, that we usually know as peso model. And so my question is for Stephen now, because you have written in your blog about the limitation of the peso model. So my question for you is, what do you think about the modalities according to which this DMA framework could address this limitation?
Thanks, Grazia, and it's lovely to be here today. So my introduction to DMA was a panel discussion I was involved with at Leeds Beckett. So I'm a PhD research student. I've spent my career 30 years in corporate communications in an agency context, but also in a professional advisory role, advising organizations. And I guess the conversation with Mark really spoke to me because I've worked with the PESO model as a planning model within practice for more than a decade. And it's always struck me as overly simplistic. So when Mark stood up and gave a presentation about this, and I think at the time there were I've just been back over my notes. I think you'd identified 14 types of media. You've now added another one in artificial, which is good to see. And that, I guess, is the point, that, you know, these planning tools should be living, breathing things responding to practice. So PESO was important. So paid, earned, shared, owned. The PESO model was important because it gave practitioners a rudimentary means of planning, extending the scope of their practice beyond media relations. So media relations earned, but adding social, adding owned content, and adding paid. And the biggest issue with it, not only the first issue was the 4 media dimensions clearly isn't enough. Mark and Vilma have embraced 15, but the second issue was about it is it put the organization at the center, and with as in a simplistic way, PESO had messages neatly emanating from the center via these different channels. And it's simply not how modern communication works, is it? Especially in a digital arena. And we're operating in a far more chaotic, decentralized ecosystem where messages are hijacked, they're amplified, we're completely out of control. And reading the Reuters report this morning on 48 market report on media, and the headline from that is very clearly that influence often is now sitting with individuals and not institutions. So that's there's those two big weaknesses that this model addresses. That clearly there are more than 4 types of media, and it gives us the means with which to understand that. But then also a strategic frame around where the organization sits and what actual level of influence it has in these different types of media.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Absolutely interesting. And for Vilma, I have a questions about this DMA framework, because if we are able to navigate these arenas, we are able also to address some tension that sometimes emerged. So if you could go more deeper in explaining us something about the tension between, for instance, strong to weak control over corporate messages and the strong to weak control over arenas or platforms. That is something that you will describe it in your framework.
Sure. So first of all, very good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe, or good morning to those of you if you are outside Europe, or good evening. I think one of the interesting part is that this actually started as a project of measurable communication. So one of my colleagues in Helsinki, Professor Elisa Juholin, and I started to map out the different places that communication needs to be measured. And this was already back almost 10 years ago. And it was during the time when Mark was still in Jyväskylä that he started to further develop this. Well, why don't we map it out in a better way? And we moved it in a way that we could help organizations understand what is reasonable and what is not. Because often we get CEOs saying, okay, I need to be on the cover of this magazine. I want this site to feature me. And the expectations might not be realistic at that time, but also at the same time, they might not be best suited for the individual, nor the organization, nor their visual, like their aims or their strategic, aims where they want to go. And so this framework basically is, and Kate, if you can share it again, the picture, that would be super. It's actually written into a wide variety of different arenas that all can to some degree be controlled by an organization, and all to some degree are not. So these are just placed as we see them currently, but this does not mean that they don't move around. As technology develops, they move around. But the basic idea, of course, is that at the very top right-hand corner, you have those arenas that you actually can control. So if you want your organizational message exactly as it is, very little interpretation or somebody making it their own, you're looking at owned media, so the corporate websites, paid media, so advertising. But even there, the context is dependent on what's going on. And pretty much everything else in the whole model is dependent on something else. And there is a tension in that sense that you cannot control the different digital arenas, but what you can do is, of course, the traditional public relations way of tue Gutes und rede darüber, the German version of do good and talk about it. That's the only thing you can do, and you can enable your faith holders or the happy stakeholders that you have to talk for you on these different arenas. But what it does, it actually opens up understanding of CEOs and many other communication leaders to see that it's not just media. We just don't need necessarily to be on New York Times. We can get similar visibility on different arenas. And then you're also looking at, well, if we are the best place to work, ranking number 1, where does that leave us? And that would be the curated media. Okay, so you're very good on curated media, but have you utilized the other arenas to make use of this information that you have? But yeah, it is a tension in the sense that there is no guarantee, and that these places move around, and that organizational messages can also bounce around. And what we're currently doing is some research into crisis, what happens during crisis situations, how different arenas activate, and if there is like an ideal route through these, where do you go? Where do you want it to move? I mean, traditionally organizations want to move it towards the more control place, but that's something that's turning out not to be that realistic anymore.
Thank you so much, Vilma. Absolutely interesting. So it seems that this framework could reveal to communication practitioners where communication can and can't be controlled, and where communication should in some way prioritize speaking versus listening. So Mark, do you mind to tell us more about this concept?
Yeah, so it's sort of reflective of what Stephen and Vilma have been saying, that a lot of today's communication should be less organization-centric, more stakeholder-centric, more public-centric, maybe even more society-centric, understanding that an organization is a business, a brand is privileged to be a member of a community, whether it's a local community or a community of customers and stakeholders, and a contributor to society. And so we're trying to emphasize that this digital media in a framework is a good way of reminding us that we should be listening more than speaking, for instance, the traditional role of speaking. So there's quite a few digital media arenas, I think, that hint at ways of and places to listen. So owned would not be one of those places. It would be more shared, where anyone can have a say if they've got access to a digital device and the internet and so on. And that's most places around the world. The other one would be recycled, where Vilma and I were talking yesterday about a case where McDonald's was entering into a crisis. Teenagers were making fun of the Grimace purple shake a few years ago, and memes were taking off. And the social media communication team were nervously watching this happening, and they were listening and observing this happening, and to a point where they decided they would enter in and create their own meme with the teenagers, and that sort of diffused the situation. Other ones would be, Vilma mentioned curated, where information intermediary businesses curate information about, might be brand information or reputation information, product information in their business reports that you can subscribe to and buy. Listening to those, observing those. Rented, so social media influencers more and more used by brands, and so there's an opportunity there for brands to get to know and understand a bit more in depth the audiences of those social media influencers. If they're using social media influencers to reach those audiences, it's a good way of trying to understand, listen to, and monitor those audiences from the brand's point of view. And then there's the traditional one of earned. Traditionally, we seek publicity, and then we listen to that through media monitoring to see what the media is saying, because they too are influential. So yeah, so that's sort of a summary, I guess, of places to listen and how to listen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would like to keep the attention still on the topic of tensions. So, Stephen, in your blog post, you referred to how each of the digital media arenas are organized by message control versus amplification and moderation. So, do you mind to tell us more about what you intend? So, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So it's a really great question, and it sort of strikes at the heart of why the DMA model is, from a practitioner perspective, is so useful, because one, you've got these increased numbers of media spheres that you're recognizing moving away from four, but you're also understanding those media types by message control and amplification versus and moderation, and so that's the point I was getting at. So both Mark and Vilma have spoken to this. A corporate website or a press release has high control. The brand, the organization has complete control over how that's created and where it's posted on its own channels, but it has likely low amplification. You can decide where you publish content, but it's unlikely to be reshaped by others. Something like social media, and Mike just cited the viral meme from McDonald's there, that's low control but high amplification. The message can be remixed, it can be parodied, as it was in the McDonald's case, and hijacked, and it travels in ways that as a brand or an organization you just cannot predict. So you've then got to figure out, as McDonald's did, it's how you continue to be relevant and part of that conversation, and align it with the organization, the brand's values. So the framework maps these media types along these two tensions. There's control on the one axis and amplification and moderation on the other. Control how much you can shape and safeguard the original message, amplification and moderation, how it spreads and how the community modifies or filters it. And from a practitioner perspective, and I can't overemphasize this, that's really useful because it reflects the reality of organizations, and it moves us away from this simplistic model where you either own or you buy or you earn space, to a much more participatory environment, and that's much more of a pragmatic perspective from my point of view.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely interesting. And Mark, so you mentioned it before, something about case studies and crisis communications. Some cases are showing how these DMAs could play out, especially in crisis. Do you mind to tell us more about these case studies?
Yeah, it's funny. As I teach this digital media in a framework over the last couple of years, I've asked students to come up with case studies, and there's so many out there, and they seem to have fun looking for them. But Vilma and I and a few other scholars, colleagues, have published a couple, and one of the initial ones we published was this really interesting one about VW. They played an April Fool's Day prank in the US. Volkswagen, I think it was back in 2021. April Fool's Day is typically, April 1st, but a couple of days before that, March 29th, they kind of hinted that they were changing their name to Volkswagen with a T, V-O-L-T, Volt, meaning electricity, to try to, later it emerged, they were trying to rebrand themselves as a vital manufacturer of electric vehicles. So yeah, a couple of days before April 1, 2021, they announced the change in the company name to promote these electric vehicles. And so they used owned digital media arenas to, for instance, they published their media release announcing this. But the funny thing was, people noticed it wasn't dated. It was on 29th of March, but the date on the media release or the press release was April 29th, suggesting that there was a mistake in publishing this, and it was removed a few hours later. But then employees anonymously got in touch with journalists, and I think they posted something on their private social media indicating that that indeed it was that it was true. I think it was the following day, VW in the US published, they announced that they were rebranding to Volkswagen, and then they put it on Twitter and things like that. And then the discussion that emerged during this time was, well, is this true or not? Or is it an April Fool's Day joke? And then people started on social media linking it back to World War II, because historically VW were linked to, supportive of the Nazi movement. So there in our case study, we point to identify owned digital media arenas, shared and earned, because the news media, particularly BBC and CNBC and others, started getting involved in this emerging, controversy. But then, a day later, the employees started saying, well, this was done in the context of April Fool's Day, and the company was forced then to announce that, yes, this was a joke, and we apologize for this. And so the controversy continued in some ways. There was a lot of discussion in earned media and shared media. When the employees anonymously released some messages, we identify that as advocated DMA, because these were employees having a say in this. And then, of course, you can imagine there are a lot of memes and parodies. So we identified lots of examples of recycled digital media arenas and so on. So it's quite an extensive case study. You can look at it in, I think it was published in the 2022. So that's the first one. There are others that I love to showcase what my students have found. And I don't know if we have time, or maybe later if we have time, I can show you what students have found. I guess unsurprising though, the last 2 years, a lot of the students have decided to focus on Taylor Swift. And so there's examples there of quite a few of, not quite the 15 digital media arenas, but at least 12 or 13 of them they've identified and analyzed how Taylor Swift's organization were involved in all these different digital media arenas during her Era tour.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Stephen, in your blog post, you referred to this framework as a new public relation planning model. So from a practitioner's point of view, so how could the professionals use this DMA framework as a planning model, according to your opinion?
So this another great question, actually, Vilma. This really strikes at the heart of where I operate, in that sort of grey area. 3 or 4 years into a PhD part-time, and coming from practice with 30 years experience, and it's something I hope to talk about at the upcoming EUPRERA conference in September. Because this strikes to the issue of the working between theory and practice taking ideas from theory and engaging with them, and too often we don't. We absolutely don't. Too often theory sits on one side, but I really felt when I had these conversations with Mark and then read the papers that he and Vilma had written, that actually this was an example of a brilliant piece of theoretically grounded work that absolutely had application in practice. And if you can align a planning model with Taylor Swift and Taylor Swift's media strategy, then it clearly has practical application. And there's those two aspects to it. There's the consideration of the media landscape, which is vastly changed, and paid, earned, shared, and owned isn't anywhere near comprehensive enough as a way of understanding it. So we now have 15 different media classifications, and as Mark has demonstrated, that it's evolving and will continue to evolve. But then also, it gives us a means by which to understand how the message can be controlled and how it's likely to be amplified, modified, or even challenged. And it's that makes it absolutely practical in terms of consulting and having conversations with clients and management about how we set realistic expectations, how we choose the right media for each campaign, we might advocate for own media spaces first because we have complete control over that environment, but then where are our audiences and how are we going to engage with them, not just through broadcast, but in this participatory to participatory landscape. And ultimately that's the value of this model, I think, and it's a brilliant example of theory meeting practice, providing a really practical tool that practitioners can use, and clearly through teaching that's being adopted by students, and I hope practice pays attention and starts to use it, because I think it has absolute strategic value.
Thank you so much.
Grazia, do you mind if I just follow up on that, because you've spot on. People are saying it's a good planning model. Vilma and I and a colleague let's plug EUPRERA again. We're submitting a paper to EUPRERA, and in our paper we were talking yesterday about the potential for 3 different uses of the digital media in a framework. There's the planning, but then perhaps during an emerging crisis like the McDonald's I mentioned before, it kind of has application as an agile model, so that during an emerging crisis, you've gone beyond the planning. Now you have to respond and be flexible. And we're hoping to argue that there is room for this DMA framework as an agile framework to be used during this emerging crisis. But then, and I think you might have mentioned this previously, Stephen, the third one is more as a diagnostic tool. So afterwards, for my students, they're using it in a diagnostic way afterwards to look at, okay, what went wrong, how did it go wrong, who was involved, and so on, along a time frame, a time scale.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for.
If I can jump in, I think one practical way to use this is also to look at compensation, because it can be that one arena is polluted or so, that it has been hostilely taken over by some activist groups or some very unhappy hate holders who are mocking the brand. And then you're thinking, okay, so, you know, do we go and join the discussion on X, and do we just keep pushing our message there? But then instead, what you can do is you can look, well, what's there available in the same area? What has a similar amount of control? What has a similar amount of reach when you're looking at the different platforms that are out there?
Thank you, Vilma. Absolutely interesting example and practical insight. Vilma, so I'll be back to you because this, as we anticipated, this DMA framework is a key features in the new Routledge textbook. So digital communication management, theories and practices for a global volatile world. This is the title. So if you could tell us more about this new textbook.
Sure. So Mark and I have been frustrated teaching some of the a bit older textbooks that don't mention AI and don't mention any of the new phenomena from the last 2 years, such as misinformation or volatility of geopolitical moves around the world that are just really wreaking havoc on many of our old theories that are out there. And we wanted to do a book that actually is a bit more up to date on all of these new tensions that public relations professionals have to deal with. And we came up with this book, which will be out in September. And it is really basically built around the different digital media arenas. So every single chapter that is produced there, we cover very much of the traditional things from CSR, reputation management, marketing, communications, all the stuff that's their internal comms. But we then also have newer stuff such as analytics or looking at misinformation and working with that. And in every place, we try to put as many case studies and as many examples as we can. And being from Europe, we are very aware that many Western-produced textbooks are mostly Anglo-American in the sense that all the examples are from Western Europe or the US. And this book breaks the mold in that one. So we've gone out of our way to get stuff from those parts of the world that are underrepresented. So parts in Africa, Asia, Latin America, to make sure that there are brands and examples also coming from those areas of the world. But what the main point I think there is that it gives, in most chapters, it gives an idea of what digital media arenas matter the most. So for example, in our chapter on financial communication, there is, Kate, can you put up the picture once more? I realize that I'm asking for the picture every time that I talk, but I guess it helps a lot. So for example, the curated is very big because all the different analyst reports, they play a very large role when it comes to big investors. So they're looking at where is this company ranked, for example. But at the same time, you still talk a lot about owned, all the reports that you're producing yourself. And even what's going on, what the employees are saying, there's very strong limitations as to what employees can say when you're working for example, for a publicly traded organization. And understanding the whole entity of a different type or different form of communication that you are doing for an organization, it's helpful to see it all mapped out.
So you anticipated so that you used this framework for teaching purposes, you both, Vilma and Mark. So my questions for Mark is if you could share something more, so especially the student experience. So how a student, for instance, responded to it, or I don't know if you have some suggestions about how other academics could use this DMA framework for teaching.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I've been teaching it for 2 years now in a module called digital communication. I think there's a lot of modules around the world that are called something similar. And I think this DMA framework is useful for those sorts of modules or courses. I do know that there are some in different countries who've reached out and are now using it, which is great. And hopefully the textbook will make that more accessible. For so for just to give an example of how I'm using it, I've mentioned already that I use it as an assignment, a case study assignment for groups. And it seems to be fun that students can use it to go looking for spaces, up to 15 spaces, where they think a brand or an organization is playing around in those different digital media arenas. And during tutorials or seminars, they can show me and we can check, and I can say yes or no, or that's interesting. They come up with really interesting examples I've never thought of before. And not only, it's not a simple case study assignment in terms of just identifying them, but they need to give a rationale about why they think the brand or the communication professionals were using certain digital media arenas in different ways, but why stakeholders were, and they had to identify stakeholders that were predominantly using these different digital media arenas. But also to add a bit more depth to the assignment, I asked them to identify different organizational messages. So the initial message during a campaign launch, for instance, and then how stakeholders took over that message. How would the students interpret the message in different ways? Some of them come up with 10 different messages within a. So the VW case study, there were a few multiple different messages from the beginning to the end. So I think that the students find it fun to do that over a period of time, especially when they can, it's kind of gamified, because two groups were using the Taylor Swift, 2 or 3 were using the Taylor Swift example, and they were trying to compete with each other to come up with the most digital media arenas or the most interesting ones, and so on. I also at the beginning like to use an example. So sometimes I try to treat students as content creators themselves, or I urge them to become content creators. So I give them an example of Boeing's. So Boeing communication professionals have been through a tough time with the Boeing 737 MAX. And so I give the context or the background of that. And I say to the students, okay, pretend you are an employee wanting to have a say, or a whistleblower. You're an employee an engineer who's concerned about the engineering of different parts of the Boeing that you're concerned with, but your managers aren't listening. And then you want to take it to social media or news media. What would you say? How would you do it? For others, I say, let's say you are wanting to play around with the artificial digital media arena. How would you use AI to change an image of Boeing, for instance? And so I just get them to immerse themselves in different situations across the 15 digital media arenas, and they have fun with that, and then they get to show that to their colleagues. So there's just some examples of some of the uses of that of the DMA framework that could make, I guess, to introduce a bit more complexity to different spaces that we talk about when we're teaching digital communication. Yeah, so that's how I do it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Okay, last questions, and then if there is some questions, we will be pleasure to answer. So, Vilma, current and future research direction related to this framework. What's the next?
You have to unmute yourself there, Vilma. The bottom left.
The silence would be one of the future directions.
Yeah.
This is the dramatic silence when I've opened another. I'm looking for. So there's also an article that I was looking for currently that's published in the New Corporate Communication Review that utilizes the digital media arenas in a very practical way that I would like to recommend. So if you can, Kate, find that the New Corp Com Review article, that would be helpful to link to this one. So future directions. Of course, we would like to know whether these degrees of control actually are as we think they are. And whether, because now we're suggesting and we're planning certain things like, okay, so here are the most controllable, here are the least controllable. Also, message credibility is something that I think we should be looking at. So, for example, do we have more credibility in some of these areas? And then, of course, which kind of different stakeholders are attracted to which platforms or which arenas, and where are they going for their information needs. So research that would, for example, link in importance the trusted sources in the digital realm. Where do they go? For example, I know AI has become the new search engine, and that really has changed also, like where do these AI platforms, where do they search for their information? What do they cite? Whose information, polluted or not polluted information, do they actually bring in? That would be, those are some areas that we would love to hear more about.
Okay, thank you so much. So I have a question for all of you, so wants to answer. So because what comes to my mind is the topic of ethics and communicative responsibility. So my questions for you is, according to your opinion, wants to answer how this framework reshape the role of ethical responsibility for instance, communicators operating across arenas with low control but high visibility, like, for instance, social media. So I don't know if you thought about, or if you have some ideas, wants to answer.
Yeah, I guess the first question is what arenas are the organizations welcome in? Because not all of these arenas are some that the organizational message is actually welcome, or it actually might be even considered spam, because there are rules that each of these platforms operates on. So understanding and respecting the different arenas and their dynamics is very central. And that's probably the easiest way to avoid ethical backlash, is not to go and spam all arenas with our message without doing any of the listening and monitoring that is so vital to understand the stakeholders on those arenas.
Another one might be the use of AI. You know, we're talking about that more and more. So artificial DMA is one of those. And I was talking to a communication practitioner yesterday about him using AI to create videos, animated videos. So creating the script, the AI creates the script, it creates the music, it creates the actual cartoon. And I said, so what's transparent? So where did transparency come into this? So the public, when they see it, it was a public health campaign. And he said, yeah, that's an interesting question. He said they didn't necessarily make it public that was AI generated, but they are thinking of, I'm not sure if they did, but on their public website, they mentioned that sometimes they will be using AI, and they give examples of that just to acknowledge that they use it. But I mean, that's I think a real ethical question.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything to add to that. But the social contract of these emerging forms of media is a really interesting space, I think, at the moment. And Mark points to it there. You cannot open LinkedIn without a conversation, and it's overwhelm around the impact of AI on public relations, the use of it within practice. But if you as a practitioner dare to post something that's generated with AI, you're called out, and the snark comes, and rightly so. And so there's a real negotiation going on socially and culturally at the moment about where these tools should be used and where they absolutely should not be used. We seem to be falling into the camp that they should not be used to create content by means, use them for data extraction and research and listening, but don't use them for create content, because somehow there's a breakdown in trust with a public at that point. But it's an interesting area for exploration. I think Bled, that's a topic at Bled, isn't it? BledCon coming up. Right.
Thank you so much. So last questions, and then we can probably address another webinar, because it's some interesting topic about it's about leadership. So according to your opinion, what does this DMA framework suggest about how leaders can build a sustained trust in arenas where their ability to moderate or control the conversation is minimal? I don't know if you have...
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think it's very important of how easily and how quickly you find that arena, because we have some research findings that suggest that the earlier on you are on an arena, the more legitimate a speaker you're considered, and the more you understand the stakeholders and the more you're considered as part of the crew instead of an actual outside spammer. So when you're thinking about leadership, I think it's a strategic question. Where do your stakeholders go to? What are the places that your stakeholders want to hear from you, and which formats are they expecting you to speak in?
Great, thank you so much, Mark.
I don't have anything else to add to that. Thanks, Vilma. That was a good point.
Okay, so we come, I think, to the end of this webinar. So thank you all, because it was a very interesting dialogue about. I invite all people to read the textbook because it's really interesting. And anyway, so thank you also to EUPRERA, because these EUPRERA talks are very food for thought for us, that we have not so much time to stop us and talk about research and about a new insight. So thank you again.
Grazia, you might want to talk about your digital, is it, what's the
sorry,
you're
right. Yeah, you're right.
Stream.
So this is a talk within this network that I am a leader about. This is the digital transformation. So for those who could be interested in, please let us know. All the information are available, and during the EUPRERA conference, we will meet in person. So this is a call for who wants to join us. Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Sorry, it's lunchtime in Italy, and this is a crucial time. Thank you all. And
Thanks,
you again.
everyone.
Have a nice day to all. Bye-bye.